Chronic sleep loss is associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, higher rates of infection, and indeed cancer. Because we haven't ever passed this information on, people don't know. And I think the key thing is...
A phrase I've heard you say in one of your talks before is alarm clocks stop the single most important behavioural experience we have.
Yeah, and that's sleep, of course. And we've so undervalued sleep. You know, it's been treated as almost an illness that needs a cure or an indulgence. And of course, in the 80s, those of us that remember the 80s, you know, people used to come in and say, oh, I've done another all-nighter. And then people used to clap them on the back. And in fact, you don't want people like that in the workplace. I mean, essentially, what we've discovered over the past sort of 20 years or so is that sleep consolidates our memory, but it's not just the retention of facts. We're actually problem solving. So if you want to come up with innovative solutions to complex problems, a night of sleep achieves that. We're also discovering that the elimination of beta amyloid, this misfolded protein that's been associated with dementia, is packaged up and got rid of whilst we sleep. So much of the stuff going on within the brain and the body whilst we sleep defines our ability to function during the day. And, you know, it's really, we've got to start embracing sleep.
You know, as I read through your book and as I think about the literature, the work you're putting out there, I think about the impact that sleep deprivation has on our entire physiology. You know, this idea that's been sitting with me the last few days is that, number one, a lot of us don't realize how sleep deprived we are.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, the way we experience the world is influenced by our levels of sleep.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, during the research for the book, the realization that the tired brain remembers negative experiences but forgets the positive ones. So tired individuals' entire worldview is influenced by a negative salience. You know, we're making decisions, remembering the negative stuff and not the positive stuff. That's just one example, I think. Yeah,
that's really profound, Russell, because if as a doctor I look around and I see how many problems we have these days with excessive negative thoughts that people struggle with.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the data in terms of how sleep deprived we are,
yeah,
potentially this is the smoking gun that's sitting there that if all of us started to pay a little bit more attention to,
yeah,
perhaps that would have a profound impact on the way we feel and, as you say, these negative thoughts.
And across the whole demographic, from youngsters and young youngsters all the way through to the elderly. I think it could make a huge difference.
Yeah. So we're recording this late morning. It is just past midday. So I know from your book now that we've just passed the danger zone, the most dangerous part of the day, right? So I feel
Absolutely.
good that we should celebrate with a glass.
Yeah.
It's 12:01. So can you explain a little bit about what is so dangerous about mornings and in particular this 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. time period?
Yeah, well, the biggie, of course, is stroke and heart attacks. Between 6 a.m. and 12 noon, there's almost a 50% greater chance of having a stroke or a heart attack.
Wow.
And of course, it represents the sort of the biological switch from the sleep resting state to the active state. So what our internal clocks are doing is anticipating increased activity. So even before we wake, blood pressure is going up, the mobilization of glucose is going up. Interestingly, the stickiness of platelets is going up, presumably anticipating an increased risk of damage and therefore the need to clot. And some of cortisol is all going up, mobilizing our bodies for activity. Now, if you're healthy, it's not an issue. In fact, it's a wonderful adaptive response. So you can get out into the new environment and exploit it to the full. But if you have health problems, then that surge in blood pressure, that increased stickiness of the blood is going to predispose to things like heart attack and stroke. And what's become very clear is that when you take your anti-stroke medication, your antihypertensives, really matters. So, for example, taking them before you go to sleep before bedtime rather than first thing in the morning over a sort of 4 or 5 year window can actually halve your chances of having a stroke or a heart attack. Now, that information isn't widely known. And I think we've got to try and get this sort of knowledge more widely accepted.
Yeah, a couple of things came up for me there, Russell. I remember, I'm going to guess 7 or 8 years ago, I was getting quite frustrated as a medical doctor with my lack of awareness over all kinds of things to do with our lifestyle and how it influences health. And I was thinking, if I knew a bit more about this and how to manipulate it, I'm sure I could help my patients more. And so I would go on my holidays around the world to various conferences. And I remember in America sitting at a conference, and there was a cardiologist called Dr. Mark Houston. And I remember him saying exactly this to me years ago. He was saying something like, most blood pressure medications should be taken in the evening. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we're giving them all that in the morning. Yeah. And people are just taking them in the morning because it's easy. It's with breakfast, I'll just take it. So I think that was the first time that lodged in my head that, the timing of these medications is important. The other thing, Russell, that came up for me as you were speaking there, on the show, we've spoken a lot about stress in the past and what happens when the stress response gets activated.
Yeah.
And what you just described happening then in the early hours, just before we wake up, those are the things of the stress response. Blood being more prone to clotting, blood pressure going up, cortisol going up. So it's almost like a mini stress response first thing in the morning.
Indeed it is. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Stress gets a bad rap. I mean, it's a shame. I mean, I liken stress as the sort of the first gear in a car. It gives you that wonderful acceleration, so it's great, but if you keep the engine in first gear, of course, you'll destroy it. And that's the problem with so much of our stress these days. It's not that it's an acute, quick shift where, for example, night shift workers, they're running on stress to keep awake and to keep functional during the night shift. And so no wonder there's all those health problems associated with that group.
Yeah. You mentioned the clock, and there's a lot in your book about our body clocks, I should say, and what they all do, what influences them. One thing I've felt and experienced when my patients, when members of the public are thinking about sleep, they're often thinking about the evening. They're thinking about, what do I do just before bed? What do I do in those hours preceding me going to my bedroom? And of course, that's important. We're definitely going to get to that. But I thought it would be useful, particularly through the lens of the clock, I guess, talk about the morning. Why is what we do first thing in the morning so important for our ability to sleep at night?
Yeah. So we have this circadian system, this sort of internal representation of a biological day. And what it does is anticipate the varied demands of the rest activity, the sleep-wake cycle. Now, for it to be of any use, the internal day needs to be set to the real day, the astronomical day. And the classic mismatch between biological time and environmental time is jet lag. And we eventually get over jet lag as a result of exposure to the light-dark cycle in the new time zone. But what we require in any time zone is daily exposure to the light-dark cycle, and particularly morning light for 90% of us. Most of us have either a long body clock or a body clock that's slightly longer. And so it will naturally drift a little bit later and later and later each day. And the effects of light are not the same. Morning light advances the clock, makes us get up earlier and go to bed earlier, whereas dusk light delays the clock. It makes us go to bed later and get up later. And so what morning light does to us is take this drifting clock and shoves it forward a bit in time so it's beautifully aligned. Now, of course, this is important at every level. I mean, we did a study a few years ago on teenagers, and we found that, and all over the world, and found that the later the chronotype, the eveningness versus morningness, the greater the evening light these young people got. So they were getting up after morning, so not getting the morning light, which would advance the clock, but they were getting evening light, which would delay the clock. So part of their going to bed late and getting up late is when they were actually seeing light. And so morning light for most of us is really important to set the biological clock, which then aligns all of our activity including the sleep-wake cycle, to the appropriate time of day.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. There's so much there. So we live according to 24-hour days.
Yeah.
Okay. But one thing I'm aware of from your book and other research is that our internal clocks are not set to exactly 24 hours. So
Exactly.
I want to talk about that and why you think that might be, because we certainly, I guess, didn't evolve for plane travel in the future. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when we go on a 12-hour flight to LA from London, we can adapt straight away, right? So that presumably wasn't evolution's goal. So I'm interested as to why it's not 24 hours in your view, but also you say morning light. So does it matter what time of morning light that is? Can people get it at lunchtime? Are we talking as soon as people wake up? And of course, that changes in the seasons,
Yes.
right? So can you help us put all those things together?
Okay, so why isn't the human body clock exactly 24 hours? Well, now here's some hand waving, because the modelers say that if you want two oscillators to align to each other, two rhythms, one is fixed. Obviously, the rotation of the Earth is fractionally under 24 hours. And if you want to fit a body clock to that, it helps if it's slightly different from 24 hours, because then it can align more easily. Now, I don't pretend to understand the mathematics behind it, but that's why it is. But there's an even...
So Mother Nature knew what she was doing.
She, of course, as always. But the really interesting question, I think, for me, is why is there such diversity in the human chronotype? So the fact that we have some people are really early larks and some people really late owls. There's a huge diversity, to the extent that you can almost bed share in some extremes. Whereas if you look at the mice or any other animal you want to study, it's all very, very similar. And I think this is something that's puzzled me for ages. And it may well be that in our society, and we've only moved very rapidly from sort of essentially small groups, tribes, interacting, it may have been useful under those circumstances to have vigilance across the 24-hour day, and having some people that were sort of awake early and could perhaps alert the group that there was danger from another tribe, for example, or some sort of animal. And that may be why we've retained this extraordinary diversity. We're very weird as a species in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? You mentioned the word chronotype.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just elaborate exactly what does chronotype mean. And then you also mentioned owls and larks. And I'm really interested in this because, me and my wife appear to have slightly different body clocks. But many people, I feel, certainly if I look at my clinical experience, Russell, and this also, I think, speaks to this idea that the body clock isn't quite 24 hours, that we can manipulate it depending on what we need it to do or what the tribe needs or what the weather is, right? A lot of the time I think, well, are evening types really evening types, or are they evening types because of the modern light environment?
Yes.
So yeah, quite a lot there.
Yeah. Okay, so what defines your chronotype, whether you're a morning person or an evening person? And there are a number of factors. The first of all is one's genetics. We now know that the clock genes and the proteins that they make, subtle changes, subtle polymorphisms in those genes are associated with morningness and eveningness. So by their contribution to our genes, our parents are still telling us what time to get up and go to bed at some level. So that's the first thing. Through development, our chronotype changes. So from about the age of 10, we want to start to go to bed a bit later and a bit later. Our lateness peaks in males at around about 21 and a half, in females about 19 and a half. And males peak later, they have a later chronotype than females. Then from those late teens, early 20s, we start to move to a more morning chronotype. So by the time we're in our late 50s, early 60s, we're getting up and going to bed on average when we got up and went to bed when we were 10. And that sort of basically maps the changes in some of the sex steroids, testosterone and estrogen. So it's thought that there's a very important hormonal modification of the clock.
So that's within individuals.
That's all got individuals.
So whatever I'm born with, let's say I was born a morning type, and I think I'm a morning type, then when I'm 10, in my teenage years, that's going to be pushed. It's going to be later and later.
Yeah.
As you say, for most males, a peak at 21, and then it's going to start going back again. But what about between individuals? There's variation there as well, right?
A huge individual variation. I think that's a really important point because, in terms of our sleep-wake patterns and our chronotype, there's massive individual variation. And there's on average about a 2-hour difference from somebody in their late 50s, early 60s to somebody in their late teens. So asking a teenager to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is like asking a 60-year-old to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Now, does that matter? I guess there's a real interest here from me, given that my son's 12 and about to enter these teenage years.
Yes.
And as a family, we prioritize sleep, or we certainly have done, but I'm already noticing with him a change in terms of his desire to do what he has done in the past. Let's put it like that. Okay.
Yeah, I think they call it testosterone poisoning, don't they?
And what I'm interested in is when we say teenagers want to go to bed later and wake up later, and we think about their chronotype, what if that teenager still went to bed early? So what's driving the change? Is it the fact that they're going to bed late, therefore they're having to stay in bed later? Like, could that be environmental, school pressure, that sort of stuff? Or do you know what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. Well, of course, the other factor, the sort of, as it were, the biological factor would be when you see light. As we just discussed, sort of morning light advances the clock, evening light delays the clock. And teenagers, particularly over the weekend, will miss the morning light, making them get up earlier, but they'll get the evening light, or the afternoon evening light, and so they'll go to bed later. So those are the three sort of biological factors. But then we have to add a couple of other things. One is, of course, the use of social media. It's very interesting. Many teenagers appreciate that they shouldn't be using social media into the early hours of the morning, but they feel that sense of being connected to their group overrides that knowledge about why it's important to be asleep. So there's that element. And in fact, it's really fascinating. Some studies have shown that lateness can be hugely late. So what happens, of course, is that they have very shortened sleep. They're driven out of bed by an alarm clock or a parent. They struggle through the school day. Often, and when you talk to many teachers, kids are actually falling asleep at the desks. So then they finish school, and then they have not just a short nap, but it can be a nap of 2 hours or so, which then pushes back the pressure to sleep that night. And so the desire to use social media and the fact that they're not as tired because they had to sleep in the late afternoon means that they can function later at night, and they get that shortened sleep. And in fact, you have to be very careful because it can lead to increasingly shortened sleep at night and longer naps after school, which, and you can fall into this sort of feedback loop of really disrupting the sleep.
If that teenager could go to sleep, let's say, on time, at a more suitable time, given what time they have to get up for school or the school bus or whatever, the sort of fixing that they can't move, does the later chronotype still matter? I.e., if they shift their environment, so actually I'm going to go to bed earlier. I'm not going to expose myself to evening lights. This may sound optimal and hypothetical as something that's practically impossible, but in theory, would that then normalize things, do you think?
Yeah, you can shift teenagers to an earlier chronotype because of light exposure, absolutely. Practically, it's very difficult. But it's in theory possible, yeah.
And this light exposure, whereas in the morning it advances the clock and in the evening it delays the clock, so pushes it back. What light exposure are we talking about here? Because let's say in the evening or at dusk you saw natural lights, not artificial lights.
Yeah.
Does that still do the same thing at pushing it back? Or does that have a different wavelength that doesn't affect us in the same way?
Well, you're sort of impinging upon what I've sort of been working on for a long time, which is how does light interact with the body clock? And the first sort of extraordinary finding was that the visual cells within the eye, the rods and the cones, are not required to detect that dawn-dusk cycle. There's a third photoreceptor within the eye. And we've been working out most recently how those receptors interact with this sort of master clock within the brain. So that's one thing. The second thing is that these photoreceptors need quite a bit of light. So we don't really appreciate, because our visual system is so good, but we live our lives in dim, dark caves. So shortly after dawn, natural light is some 50 to 100 times brighter than average domestic light conditions. And so really what the clock is looking for is a bright light signal. And so we're talking in the hundreds to thousands of lux range. So if you think of natural light, okay, moonlight would be 0.01 lux, and a bright sunny day, even in the UK, can just about get up to 100,000 lux. And those weird, amazing photoreceptors need, as I say, this sort of 100 to 1,000 lux range. Now, it's complicated because it depends upon how long you're exposed to that light. So you can compensate to some extent for a lower light intensity by increasing the duration. And it's worth bearing in mind, until the late 80s, it was thought that the human circadian clock was not regulated by light at all. Because when people use sort of relatively low levels of light that would shift the biological clock or entrain the biological clock of a mouse, it had no effect at all.
But this is in the 1980s, right?
Yeah, in the late 1980s.
I read that this morning in your book, and that shocked me because 1987, right?
Yeah.
I was just finishing primary school. It's not... Maybe it is, but it doesn't seem that long ago to me. And I thought, when I read that, I had to reread it, this idea that back then, which wasn't that long ago, we didn't think light hugely influenced our circadian rhythm. And now that's considered fact. And I think, well, what else is going on that we don't know at the moment?
Well, that's what's so exciting about this field. But I remember, doing my PhD, and I got my PhD in 84. And when you did public talks or anything, people say, well, how is it regulated? And we'd say, it's primarily social cues and food. And I remember being actually at that first presentation in 1987. And, it was an audible gasp around me. Oh, my God, you just need a lot of light. And, of course, now we know light is incredibly important for the regulation of human circadian rhythms, but you need quite a bit of it. And this is where we fall into some problems, because there's a lot of stuff out there saying you shouldn't look at a Kindle immediately before you go to bed because it'll shift the biological clock. So the most detailed study, which was from a group at Harvard, asked people to look at a Kindle on its brightest intensity 4 hours before bedtime. And they asked them to do this on 5 consecutive nights. And after that, on the fifth day, sleep was delayed by an average of 10 minutes. And it was just statistical. And as one of my colleagues said, it may be statistically significant, but it's biologically meaningless.
Wow.
And so... But we do know that light in the evening can delay the clock. But how much and what intensity and for how long is still being resolved. Clearly, the brighter the light and the longer you see it before bedtime could shift the clock. But what we do know that light is doing is increasing alertness and therefore delaying sleep onset. So it's probably not the light from the devices changing the clock, but it's the light from the devices changing alertness and therefore delaying sleep.
Yeah, super, super interesting. So if we just stick to what that study showed, that was on a Kindle. I know when I've heard you speak before that you regard Kindles as quite different from smartphones or looking at social media. Perhaps you could explain why that is.
Well, because a Kindle is fairly, you're just reading it, basically. Whereas a smartphone, you're checking your emails, you're looking at social media, you're checking the news, you might even be listening to music at the same time. And so these are really interactive devices, and they will be increasing alertness and therefore delaying sleep onset.
Yeah, super interesting. In terms of light, just to finish off in the evening then, we're talking about the complexities of light, how much, how long for, all these kinds of things. Some people who are promoting health and well-being are talking about the importance of morning light, morning natural light. I know there's one neuroscientist in America who talks about getting 10 to 30 minutes, if you can, within half an hour of waking up. Okay, so that's very clear guidance. I want to know your view on that.
The data are good for that. I mean, really. I mean, so for example, the Ken Wright studies have shown beautifully that bright morning light, real light, not artificial light, can advance the clock and really shift individuals 2 hours earlier. So there's no question about it. And you can mimic this in the lab as well. So, for example, 10,000 lux for 30 minutes from a light box will also set the clock. So the data are there pretty solid.
So we say advance the clock. What if someone doesn't want to advance their clock and they wake up and they're like, you know what? I've got a late work night out tonight and I won't be back for my normal time. And I've never thought of this question before, but I'm just intrigued. Might one then think, hey, for tonight, I'm actually going to not expose myself to light for a couple of hours because I want to delay that? Or is that hard to say?
It probably will have a small effect. I mean, the tricky thing is for those 10% of individuals who are really morning types, and it's a shame really, because most of their colleagues will be intermediate to late types. And of course, they will be then forced on a Friday and a Saturday evening to stay up way beyond where they want to be. And they sort of complain bitterly that, oh God, all my friends want me to stay up. Of course, for the work environment, it's great. They can get up, go to the gym early and then go on to work. Whereas most of us who are late types find that a struggle.
So you're happy with that 10 to 30 minutes natural light recommendation? Would you ideally have people do that as soon as they can after waking?
Certainly. The earlier, the bigger the effect. Yes. And it's very important across the spectrum. So, for example, in the nursing home environment, up until fairly recently, the light in those nursing homes was really low. I mean, terribly low. Some cases in the television room, it would be just sort of 10, 20 lux. I mean, crazy low. Now people are realizing that if you increase the light in the day spaces, then you can actually improve the sleep-wake behavior of individuals in a nursing home. And where it's been looked at in individuals showing mild dementia, you could actually improve cognition by 10% simply by increasing the light within inside, and also using other tricks like having breakfast by a window where there's a lot of light coming through.
Wow, that's fascinating. And then in terms of evening, I want to draw a distinction between natural light and artificial light. So let's say you live in a country where you have long light evenings at particular times of the year, like the UK, for example. Yeah. You want to get your morning light in the morning, which is clearly a lot easier in a UK summer than it is in the winter.
Yep.
What happens if you want to be outside in the evening? So it's still natural. It's not your screen. It's not social media. It's not the news. It's not all that attention stimulating information. Is there something going on in natural light where actually, the evening light perhaps doesn't shift the clock as much, or does that still do it?
Well, of course, when we're all agricultural workers, we got symmetrical exposure to dawn and dusk. Yeah. And so, the morning light would advance us, but then that was counteracted by the dusk light, which would delay us. And so it was fine. And the problem that many of us face now is that we get asymmetrical exposure to the dawn-dusk cycle, which invariably means most of us will miss morning, but get lots of dusk light, and therefore get up later. We'll delay the clock. Now, in terms of the quality, we've talked about the intensity, we've talked about the duration, but we should also touch about the colour, the wavelength of light. Now, those specialised photoreceptors are maximally sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum. In fact, intriguingly, if you look at the blue of a really beautiful blue sky, that's where they're maximally sensitive. So there's been a suggestion that actually only blue light is important. But again, it's more complicated than that because the response is like a bell-shaped curve. It's maximally sensitive in the blue, but of course it doesn't mean that the receptors won't detect shorter wavelength or indeed longer wavelength light. Again, it's how long you're exposed to it. We also now know, which is turned out to be really confusing, that the rods and cones, which we know are not required for the regulation of the clock, talk to those specialized photoreceptors so they can modulate their activity. Some of the rods and cones seem to add sensitivity, and others seem to inhibit the responses. So it's turning out to be really complicated, and we don't fully understand why.
So the best advice would be, let's say someone is trying to get on top of their circadian rhythm and their sleep, and they feel either for work reasons or for other reasons they're going to bed too late. The best advice at the moment would be to try and limit light exposure in the evening. Even if it's natural light, you still want to be a bit careful.
Yeah, and if you are an extreme late type and you really are struggling, then what you need to do is set the alarm and either get outside first thing in the morning or get a light box, which will advance the clock and make it easier for you to get up for job or whatever reason. Yeah.
I know you were on the Chris Evans Breakfast Show recently talking about your book, and I remember in that conversation, Chris said, because he, for many years, is presenting on live radio, I think at the moment at 6:30 a.m. And I think he said to you that he goes to bed at 7 p.m. or he at least puts an eye mask on at 7 p.m. So it's reducing how much light is coming through his eyes. I think he said in that conversation with you, it had a massive difference. And then when he wakes up at 4 a.m., he puts all the lights on in his bedroom as bright as possible.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And I know he was saying it's had a huge difference for him.
And of course, it maps onto exactly what we know about the system. He's doing exactly the right thing for what his requirements are, which is to get up early and then perform early. Yeah.
And this is where I feel it's very empowering for people, even if they were to find out their chronotype and them to find out that, man, my job is actually in disharmony with my natural chronotype. You can do things, can't you, to manipulate it so you're maybe not as vulnerable as you might have been.
That's right. And I think we tend to feel as though our body clock is this fixed thing, just like our sleep-wake cycle. And it's not. It's dynamic and influenced by a whole range of different factors that can be tweaked to our advantage.
Yeah. So interesting. Russell, one of the things that's helped my sleep a lot over the past few years, quite a few things recently. One is to avoid any sort of emotional stimulation in the evening. Yeah. So this has probably been going on for 6 or 7 years now. I've had to educate the people around me, particularly my family, that I go to bed early, I wake up early. It suits me. I don't know if I am actually a morning type. I certainly live like a morning type, but then I set everything up around that because ever since my kids were born, they've always got up really early. And I know for me, I'm a much better human being when I've had time to myself in the morning before anyone else is there. So I would shift it back so that I could have an hour to myself before they wake up. So I'm now in a position where I usually go to bed by 9 o'clock at the latest, and I'm up by 5 a.m. at the latest. When I can stick to that consistently, I feel fantastic.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we should all be doing. We should be defining, what our biological needs are, and also, of course, what our social needs are, or societal needs are, and particularly our work, and try and tune ourselves accordingly.
Yeah,
it's so important.
Yeah, and so that process required me to help people around me understand that, look, after 7:30, I really do not want to be contacted with anything unless it's an emergency.
I know. And of course, it's very difficult because, of course, towards bedtime is the only time when many couples get chance to talk about stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, it can be charged. And so for example, I have banned any discussion of family finances before we go to bed or anything like that. You have to carve out time at a different time. The other thing that's interesting about your earlier bedtimes, of course, is you'll be eating much earlier.
Yeah.
And that can be very important. The data now are very clear that trying to concentrate one's calorie intake during breakfast and lunchtime and a very light supper or an earlier supper that you can possibly manage is better for our metabolic health and reduces the chances of weight gain, obesity and type 2 diabetes. So you have a double advantage there by going to bed earlier.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So I think that's a really important point, and that really speaks, I think, to this wider issue, which is a lot of the things that we would optimally do to optimize our circadian rhythms, optimize our sleep, optimize all these different functions in our bodies sometimes have to be done in conflict with what society is driving us to. And I think there's a much wider piece there. Just to finish off on light, at least for the moment, because I think it will keep coming back and it's so important. One of the things that has really helped me over the last years is, I try my best not to be on my screen before bed. Usually I'm good with that, although I'm human and, I fall prey to the temptation like anyone else might do. I try and read before bed. And in my bedside lamp, I've now changed, maybe for a couple of years, maybe not even quite that long, but certainly recently, I put these low lux bulbs in. So I've got this like amber low lux bulb. Now, I really feel it's made a massive difference the way I feel. It just feels softer. And if I'm in another room or staying somewhere where they've got a usual bulb, and I think, wow, this is quite obnoxiously bright. So are these things helpful in your view?
They are indeed. It sort of maps on again to the biology. This is what you'd certainly recommend because the lower the light, you'll reduce alertness and it'll be easier to get to sleep. And of course, if it's bright light, then of course you will shift the clock. But most artificial light is not going to have much of an effect. But the other thing, of course, is that what you're doing is defining the sleeping space. And so, for example, we need to sort of reinforce the fact that the bedroom or the sleeping space is what you do when you want to go to sleep. So you have a lovely mattress, you have great pillows, you might even have a distinctive smell like lavender or something else because you associate that distinctive smell with the sleep state. And I know people who, when they go and they travel and they're staying in a hotel room, they'll take a partner's perfume or aftershave because that defines the sleeping space for them. So the extent to which those are almost placebo effects, it doesn't matter. If they work, then you should embrace them.
When it comes to blue light blocking glasses, I'm interested what your views are. Before you answer that, I will say as a clinician, what I have found is for some people, they appear to have been transformative. Now, what does the science say? What is your view based upon all your years of research?
Yeah, I mean, blue light blocking glasses were sort of originally introduced because it was thought that blue light would promote age-related macular degeneration. And the evidence for that is a bit mixed. Certainly, you'll get more damage with blue light in a laboratory setting. So sort of if you expose cells to blue light, there's a greater chance of those cells undergoing apoptosis, those cells dying, as it were. But when that's translated to the natural realm, it's not clear that blue light is having much of an effect on age-related macular degeneration. This has also been studied in the context of cataracts. So, for example, blue-blocking lenses have been introduced to reduce the blue light getting in and therefore age-related macular degeneration. The evidence for that is not great. There was a lot of concern that these blue blocking lenses were also going to disrupt the clock because, after all, the clock is maximally sensitive to blue light. We've done some studies showing that it doesn't matter whether you use a blue blocking or a UV blocking. It doesn't. And in fact, it's quite interesting. Most artificial lenses allow less blue light through than a natural lens. So we would be naturally exposed to more blue light anyway. So I think that's where the sort of the origins of these blue blocking glasses and things are used. Now, in terms of the circadian system and the arousal systems, we do know that blue light is the most effective wavelength, and Christian Kjochen has done this from Switzerland, in increasing alertness. So if you want to reduce alertness in the evening, it's likely that a blue blocking set of glasses will be useful. Will it be useful in terms of the clock? Well, possibly. But it depends, again, how long, how bright the environmental light is.
I guess this speaks to a much wider point, which I think comes through in all the work, all the talks I've seen of yours, everything I've read in your book. It's this idea that sleep is highly individual.
Yeah.
And I know there's many myths out there that you're keen to bust, one of them being that we all need 8 hours.
Yeah. I mean, that was part of the motivation for writing Lifetime, because I think that there's been a tendency to feel that, we have to have we've got to get 8 hours. And I remember one person came up to me and they said, I don't get 8 hours of sleep. Am I going to die? And I sort of said, well, I can assure you, you will die, but it may not be anything to do with not getting 8 hours of sleep. And, because I'm being a bit flippant, but actually the natural sort of span for humans is 6 hours to maybe 10 and a half hours. And so that's in the natural range. And I think people get very anxious that if they're not getting 8 hours, they're going to, it's going to be a disaster. Now, I think you have to be careful because the tired brain is very good at fooling itself that it's okay. So you need to really be tough about assessing what your sleep needs are. And if you can function optimally during the day, if you're feeling fine, then chances are you've had a good night of sleep. If you need an alarm clock to drive you out of bed in the morning, if it takes you a long time to wake up, if you crave caffeinated drinks, if your family, friends, work colleagues say, oh, you're being a bit, where's your sense of humour? You're a bit more irritable. And critically, if given the opportunity to sleep longer on free days or indeed on holiday, you sleep much longer. That's all telling you you're not getting enough sleep. So what we all have to do as individuals is define how much sleep that we need for optimal daytime performance.
And I guess that would also depend on what we're doing, right? Because let's say, I don't know, that you have defined that, hey, you know what, I keep hearing about this 8 hours, but I think I sleep for, 6 hours 30 each night or 6 hours 45.
Yeah.
And I'm fine. And I wake up without an alarm clock and I'm got energy and I feel emotionally quite with it,
Yeah.
But then let's say you start, training for a half marathon, or maybe at the weekends you go on long runs or something. It's also having that awareness to go, well, yeah, in the week, I'm maybe okay with this amount, but actually if I'm really exerting myself physically and I have a desk job Monday to Friday, maybe I need more at the weekend. And I guess the reason, I don't know what your view would be on that. One of the reasons I asked that is because I think Roger Federer is well known to, is it 10 hours or 12 hours a night? I think he talks a lot about how much sleep he has and how important that is to his optimal performance as a tennis player.
Yeah.
A few little subtleties there. Do you think physical activity levels make a difference in terms of how much we need? And I guess, how would you put all that together?
Well, of course, the famous long sleeper was Albert Einstein, who basically sat at his desk for every day. And he craved 10 hours of sleep. So I think that it's probably influenced by athletic performance. And certainly there are some data suggesting that really strong training is associated with slightly longer sleep, but it's not an overwhelmingly increased amount of sleep.
Right.
And I think, Federer just needs that amount of sleep and for his optimal performance, same way that Einstein did. And, in the book, I compare Einstein to Salvador Dali.
You do?
It's great, undergraduate lectures. I say, Einstein, classic, sort of slept 10 and a half hours. So, perfect example of long sleep genius. And then, one of the students said, well, what about Salvador Dali? He didn't sleep at all, really. And his trick was, of course, to hold a metal spoon in his hand and sit in a chair, and when the spoon dropped from his hand, when he fell asleep, it hit a metal plate on the floor and woke him up. But of course, Dali was the first to recognize that his altered state of mind, because of his chronic lack of sleep, gave him the sort of surreal vision to generate the art that he generated. So
it depends what's the goal.
It depends what the goal is.
If the goal is to hallucinate and have an altered state of consciousness, and you need that for your job, you know what? Sleep deprive yourself all you want.
Yeah, that's true. It may make you impossible to live with, as Dali, of course, was. But if you want an altered state of consciousness, then decide, deprive yourself of sleep.
Well, maybe now's a good point in the conversation to make the case for sleep, right? First of all, how sleep deprived are we as a society? And then secondly, what are those consequences?
Yes, sleep deprivation varies a lot because, of course, sleep need varies a lot. But I think on average, people are saying that we're sleeping 1, maybe 2 hours less than we were in the 1950s. And I think those data are pretty robust. And certainly that's the case in adolescence, big time. And so what are the consequences? Well, short-term sleep loss, we see changes in our emotions and our cognitive performance. So we increased levels of irritability, the failure to process information accurately. We do stupid and unreflective things. We are less empathetic. I mean, it's really fascinating. We fail to pick up the social signals of friends and family. We're less socially connected. We have reduced capacity to remember things. We are less creative. So all the things, reduced sense of humor. I mean, all the things that make us this extraordinary creature, this amazing humans, all this creativity and wonderful and interconnectedness goes as a result of even short-term sleep loss. Longer term, as many individuals are experiencing at the moment, is associated with this falling asleep uncontrollably, so microsleeps. And it's estimated in the States that 100,000 crashes on the American freeway are as a result of people falling asleep at the wheel. The American Automobile Association suggests it's much greater than that, perhaps as high as 300,000. And of course, if you're falling asleep at the wheel, you can't stop yourself. So those crashes tend to be really bad crashes. We also see that there's changes in immune responses. So it's likely, because we're chronically tired, we're activating in a sustained way the stress axis. And that's going to push up blood pressure. It's going to throw glucose into the circulation. So it then disposes to things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and indeed, because of the suppression of the immune system, high rates of infection and indeed cancer. Some very convincing studies showing that night shift work, for example, night shift nurses have higher rates of colorectal cancer and breast cancer. In fact, those data are now so good that the World Health Organization has listed night shift work as a probable carcinogen. So I think the really key point is that chronic sleep loss is so much more than feeling tired at an inappropriate time. It's associated with an impact upon our health at every level.
Yeah, I mean, what you just went through there, it impacts negatively our day-to-day lives. You mentioned empathy. I mean, what do we need for good quality relationships with partners, children, work colleagues, family? We need empathy.
Yeah, and invariably in the workplace, you need creativity. You need people to be able to work together. You want to reduce irritability. You need often a good sense of humor. And so really, we should be really promoting good sleep to improve productivity.
Yeah. It speaks to something you said earlier on in our conversation, that when we are sleep deprived, we forget all the positive experiences and remember the negative ones, which of course completely alters your view and perception of the world. It feels like this dark, scary place rather than an uplifting, hopeful, joyful place. You mentioned, yes, these short-term consequences, but also these pretty scary long-term consequences. Now, one thing I really appreciate about the messages you try and put out there into the public is you really seem to be trying to help promote health without scaring people. Now, of course, these statistics are scary, and there's two groups of people I want to keep at the forefront of our mind now as we think about these negative side effects. We mentioned shift work, and I want to talk about shift work because what I read in your book is that 1 in 8 UK workers currently are shift workers. That's probably only going to increase. That's a lot of people. And I can't imagine what it's like for a shift worker to just hear what you said the WHO say, which is a probable carcinogen. That's not a nice thing to hear if you work shifts. If you're if you're a nurse looking after people to help their health and you think, but at the same time, I'm wrecking mine in the process. So shift work is something I want to talk about. But also, the other thing I've noticed as I've been trying to raise awareness of sleep now in books and podcasts for maybe 5 years, unwittingly, we can often end up scaring people and making them feel worse and more anxious. Now, young parents often will get in touch and say, look, Ron, love what you said. I understand about sleep, but I'm really worried. Mm-hmm. My 3-month-old doesn't sleep through the night, or whatever is going on. So many parents get really scared when they hear this sort of stuff. So if we address parents first of all, short-term sleep deprivation, long-term, is it okay for a few years if a parent's sleep deprived? Help us sort of get less scared about that if you can.
Well, I think there's two issues here. One thing that our society, or in the developed nations at least, has shifted very rapidly from the extended family to the nuclear family, where the parents become the sole providers for their children. And it's usually the mother. And what's happened up until fairly recently is that childcare was a distributed activity. And so when the mum got tired, there was an aunt or a sister or a friend who would take over so that the mum can get some sleep. And if you look at the primate societies, you see that care is distributed across the group. We have never evolved to be the sole parents, as it were, of our children. And I think the first point to make is that young mums in particular, but both parents, should not be afraid to reach out. And I think there's this sort of terrible guilt that I can't cope because I'm feeling tired. Well, no surprise. We never evolved to look after our children in this manner. So before babies are born, it's really important to think about the support network that you can put in place to try and mitigate some of the chronic sleep loss. Now, what are the long-term consequences of this? It's not clear. I suspect that there are probably buffers that kick in that actually prevent some of the damaging effects of chronic sleep loss during those sort of few months. I don't know. And in fact, I think it's a really important area of study.
Yeah. I think, what you said there, I think is really helpful. First of all, just recognize that the way we're bringing kids up now is tough.
Yeah.
We never had to do it like this. Recently, Russell, my wife's father has been away in Kenya for a couple of months to see his family. And my mother-in-law has been staying with us on and off for a couple of months. And let me tell you the difference. It's little things, but just having a third adult in the house, when it comes to childcare, it's not just one more person. It seems to have changed everything.
The whole dynamic changes.
The whole dynamic changed.
Yeah.
I was
absolutely.
like, this is incredible. This is what humans have always done, yet many of us have moved away for work, for opportunity. We don't have those support systems. So I thought that hopefully takes the pressure off people to at least go, yes, I know it's hard, but yes, it is hard. It really is hard. You're not broken. It's not that you can't cope. No, none of us can cope with that.
Yep.
So I think that's a really nice message. But also that message, you can reach out,
Yes.
Maybe you need to phone a friend and say, hey, listen, I'm knackered. Could I just have a nap? Could you come while I have a nap?
And it's not a sign
please?
Of weakness.
Yeah.
It's actually, embracing our biology in a sense. It's tragic that I think that young parents don't know that and feel guilty about it. It's simply wrong. And it's, it's so many unintended consequences that we're facing at the moment. And sort of with increased wealth and independence, we think, right, we don't have to live with our parents anymore, or we can move a long way away from them. And yet we've lost something in the process. I mean, I was I'm very close to my grandparents who looked after me while my mother was working, and it was as you say, it was a big thing. So mummy's coming home, and it was all excitement, and you have that dynamic environment. And clearly, we are where we are, but people shouldn't be afraid to reach out. I think that's so important.
Let's talk about shift work. There's all kinds of things. There's a huge section on shift work in the book, which I think will be very helpful for anyone. We mentioned how many people, of course, are shift workers.
Yeah.
We mentioned the potential health problems of that.
Yes.
Something I read in your book, which I found fascinating, was that over 90% of night shift workers, was it even 97%?
97, yeah.
They don't adapt.
No. And so that's going back to light again. So you've got relatively dim light within the workplace, within the office or the factory. And then, of course, on the journey home or on the journey in, or during the day, you're going to experience bright natural light. And the clock always defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime. So the assumption by employers...
The clock always defers to the brighter light signal. I think that's a really powerful thing.
And that's why we don't shift. And in fact, there's one group, there's a lovely study from the University of Surrey, Josephina Rent, and that 3%, some of them are North Sea oil workers, because what happens is they're out on the rig at night under these great arc lights, and then they're in windowless metal boxes during the day. And they do switch, and so they become nocturnal, as it were.
Wow.
Then, of course, it's really tough for them because then they have 2 weeks of shore leave and they're completely maladapted to their friends and family. But the serious issue is you don't adapt. And so I remember chatting to the chairman of the CBI, many years ago now, and giving a speech saying, we're going to cure the problems of British industry by running it on a 24/7 basis. No need to build lots of offices in London, the rush hour, etc., etc. Deeply well-meaning individual, no idea of the biological consequences, and the assumption that the clock will adapt to the demands of working at night. And for 97% of people, it doesn't.
We're not machines. We're human beings, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And I think you could apply that across all kinds of different things in society.
It is fascinating because we've achieved so much. I mean, it's phenomenal what we've achieved as a species. But it comes with some massive arrogance. And what we've assumed is that we can do whatever we like, whenever we choose. And because we've invaded the night cheaply with electricity since the 1950s onwards, we've invaded the night and have thrown away that really important part of our biology, which is sleep.
That's interesting. It was only in the 1950s when we've
big acceleration.
Well, we've really aggressively invaded the night. That's not long.
No.
Through an evolutionary lens, that's just a blink.
Yeah, and clearly, we've been creeping in. The aristocrats were using candles. And in fact, a sign of wealth was you would eat later in the evening and you'd light your... But remember, a candle, in the early 19th century was the equivalent of a working man's daily wage. So only the rich could have light. And of course, why would you burn fat, which is what candles were made of, when this is food? And of course, food was incredibly scarce for so many people, working people, 200 years, 150 years ago.
We'll stay on shift work for the minute, but this doesn't just apply to shift work. Driving tired, and a pretty alarming statistic in your book about what it means to drive at 4 a.m. for most people.
Yeah, Drew Dawson has done a wonderful study. Drew Dawson's based in Australia. And he compared the cognitive performance, the loss of one's ability to process information across the day, and found a very poor cognition around about 4 o'clock in the morning, where it got to its lowest point. And he compared that with the loss of cognitive ability with consuming sufficient alcohol to make you legally drunk. And on the scale, it was about a -15 drop in cognition when you were legally drunk. But at 4 o'clock in the morning, it was -20. So if listeners take nothing from this at all, other than the fact that if you're driving at 4 o'clock in the morning, your ability to process information is worse than if you were legally drunk.
Okay, this is big, right? Because we've touched a few times on this whole societal condition, what we're being asked to do now, or what we think we have to do to fit in with society versus what's biologically optimal. Some people, of course, have to get up early for work.
Yeah.
Some people now drive through the night.
Yes.
Lorry drivers, big cargo in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure they've got certain regulations, certain things that they do in order to be less tired at that time. But, driving at 4 a.m., for most of us being worse than when we might be legally drunk, that's pretty alarming.
It's extraordinary.
Because also then let's think about, look, I don't really do this anymore. But if I think about my social culture in my 20s and 30s, you go to a mate's wedding, right? There'll be some late nights, a few drinks, and then you drive home on the Sunday. You're just to be super clear, you're fully sober,
Yes.
but culturally it's okay. Oh yeah, I'm knackered. I've just got to drive now for 4 hours. But we're putting people's lives at risk, not just our own. We're putting other people's lives at risk. So culturally, this idea of driving when tired, I think is something we all need to face.
Well, I think it's like smoking. We're not only endangering our own health, but the collateral damage is that we're harming other people.
But people will do this.
Yes. And but I think it's a matter of education and a failure to appreciate. Junior doctors, a study published fairly recently showed that 57% had either had a crash or a near miss on the drive after the night shift. So now, again, we're going into scary territory. But the key point is there's stuff we can do about it. We're not going to put the 24/7 society, genie back in its bottle. So what can we do to mitigate some of these problems? Well, knowing that we're going to be vulnerable to having a crash on the drive home, then we, or employers, and I think there's a serious duty of care here, is they should make available or subsidize the use of devices you can put on the dashboard that measure head nod or the fact that the car is veering and alert you to that, and that an alarm goes off and make sure you're woken up. And of course, many high-end German cars now have this technology.
Do they really?
built in? Yeah, but that's something that could be done. Knowing that night shift workers have higher rates of cancer, coronary heart disease, diabetes 2, etc., why don't we institute higher frequency health checks? Every 6 months for these individuals to catch these conditions before they become chronic. What food do we provide for our night shift workers? High rates of cancer, coronary heart disease, all the rest of it, high fat, high sugar. Nobody, to my knowledge, is actually supplying easy to digest, high protein snacks to their workforce throughout the night. Now, it's tricky because if you're tired, you're programmed to eat more sugar. But at least we should make that option available.
Why high protein?
Because it doesn't have the same impact as carbohydrates and fats on coronary heart disease and indeed cancer.
But that would be quite easy, right? Let's say for a hospital, which is staffed at night, it would be quite easy either to have those snacks or to work with a nutritionist and make in bulk protein shakes full of phytonutrient-rich foods that are easy to digest, that are tasty, that they could give people. It's not that hard.
No, and in fact, I think there's a phenomenal commercial opportunity here. Somebody should develop this and make it available to, a very significant percentage of the workforce. Yeah. And the other area, I think, is education. In some sectors, the divorce rate is 6 times higher in the night shift compared to the day shift. And 6 times. So what we should be providing is education not only for the individual who's doing the night shift, so they're aware of some of the consequences, but so that the people they live with also understand that they're not turning into monsters, but this is a kind of the biological consequence of driving your biology outside of its normal range. And one other area, which I think is worth trying, is that we talked about this great diversity of chronotype, whether you're a morning type or an evening type across the population. Well, wouldn't it be smart to chronotype your workforce so that, for example, the late types did the later shift and the morning types did the morning shift? What you want to avoid, of course, is putting a late type onto a morning shift, which is a really bad idea. So, as I say, we've got to be pragmatic, but I think there are things that we can do now to mitigate some of these problems.
Yeah. We don't want to be too scary, but I can't stop thinking about that as a doctor myself, that 57% figure.
Yeah.
I have told this story, I think, at least twice on this podcast, where when I was a SHO, a senior house officer, so I think 2nd or 3rd year after qualifying, after what would it have been? Probably a 36-hour shift, certainly between 30 and 36 hours, I properly fell asleep on the M60 in traffic. Thankfully, I think I fell asleep in a traffic jam, and then I was only woken up by horns because the jam had, moved on. So, it could have been a lot worse.
Yes.
Right? This is scary because there are people around the country, around the world right now who are vulnerable of dying as a consequence of their jobs. That sounds extreme. I don't think what I've just said is extreme based upon what I'm reading. And you mentioned duty of care for employers.
Yes.
Surely this should have been put in place yesterday. Like, is it justifiable for people in shift work to be getting in a car now? Where does the culpability lie? What if they have an accident? Is that personal responsibility, or is it, no, but my employer didn't do anything? Or, and of course, this comes into finance and expenses, but providing taxis.
Well, that's what the Royal Perth Hospital, at least when I was visiting Western Australia, would actually do. They would actually provide taxis to get people home.
Yeah. And I know there's an expense thing here, but we're talking about lives here, not just that individual's life. So, yeah, that really hits home big time.
And there's a very poignant description in the book of a police officer who contacted me actually several years ago saying, what can we do? I just had a friend who after the night shift fell asleep at the wheel and drove his car into a tree and was killed outright. And nobody's warning us that this is going on. And that's part of the educational piece, because I think if people realised of the danger of doing this, they'd think twice about it, and try and get something else in place. I mean, maybe we should be making sure that there's, I don't know, somewhere to sleep after the night shift, so you weren't driving home chronically tired. It's these sorts of things that we need to think about. There are, again, we're not going to cure it, but we can mitigate some of the problems, and it's not rocket science.
No.
It's low-hanging fruit that we could institute now across the workforce and make a difference.
I don't know when my behaviour around this started to change, but I'm pretty diligent these days over when I'll drive. Now, I don't need to drive much anymore for work. I remember in one of the practices I used to work at, there was a probably 45 minutes to an hour commute each way on a motorway, and depending on traffic conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And I appreciate not everyone is in a position to make active decisions. Depends on work, finances, all kinds of things. But when I'm weighing up how to get somewhere and whether to take my car or not, how tired I'm going to be absolutely plays in my decision making. And I think, as I think about it, Russell, I think one of the first times it really struck me, it was probably 2015, 2016. I was making a documentary for BBC One. I don't think this bit actually aired in the programme in the end, but is it in Guildford, where is the driving simulators?
I think so, yes.
I think, what happened? I can't remember the exact ins and outs, but one of the participants, we put them in the simulator and we watched them drive, and then we compared it with one night's sleep deprivation and then alcohol. Yeah. And it was noticeable after sleep deprivation. It's just like you said with that research, it was worse than when they'd been drinking. Yep. I was like, wait a minute, that's just fatigue. And their reaction time to things popping up in the simulator to when they'll press the brake was significantly increased. So I think that possibly has played into my head for many years about that. Number two, I think a point here is that you bring up this term microsleeps, right? Number one, what is a microsleep? And number two, I've heard you say before, think about these microsleeps that you don't know they're going to happen. Yeah. Right. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So it's really, so microsleep is essentially an uncontrollable and an unpredictable episode of sleep. And so you can be going along and you will just fall asleep. And of course, that's extremely dangerous if you're driving. So people think they're okay, and then they will just sort of have a microsleep and then a crash or whatever. And it's frightening because so many people say, "Oh yeah, I've had one of those." I was sort of nodding, and then I realised I was sort of in the next lane. But for the grace of God, you would be killed, or you'd have killed somebody else.
Well, you mentioned in your book all these things. What the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, was it a Selby crash and Air India? You've mentioned all this stuff. Can you maybe speak to some of those?
One of the really interesting ones, I think, was the Air India flight where the pilot was landing the aircraft and then fell uncontrollably asleep, and the plane hit the deck with a huge loss of life. Now, how do we know he fell asleep? because you could hear snoring in the cockpit recorder. And, this is not something that he would have wanted to do, but it sort of really illustrates the fact that you have no control over these microsleeps. But if you're chronically tired, that's what's going to happen. And, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker that hit the reef off the coast of Alaska. Now, everybody says, it's because the captain was drunk. Well, yes, he was drunk, and he was asleep in his cabin, and it was a chronically tired, inexperienced individual. And they were telling him, turn the ship, you're going to hit the reef. But he couldn't process the information because he was so tired. And it's a really good illustration, again, of one's chronic tiredness. It prevents you from processing information accurately. And, we've sort of touched on this, but this is what's so dangerous, because the tired brain is so tired it can't detect how tired it is. And we can fool ourselves that we're okay, whereas we're not.
Russell, I want to just ask you your view on my interpretation of my dad's working life. I know from research, you've written a beautiful section on it in your new book, about the impacts that sleep deprivation has on the immune system.
Yeah.
And all kinds of other biological processes in the body. My dad, at the age of 57, got lupus. Now, it's very unusual for an Asian man who is slim. It's not the profile that's normally Caucasian women in their 30s or 40s. Typically, of course, there's always variation here. Now, for many years, I cared for my dad until he died 9.5 years ago. And I didn't know then what I know now since his death. But I am convinced, I have a deep knowing that my dad's lifestyle gave him lupus. Now, I'm not asking you to say yes or no on that. I just want to share with you certain aspects of his lifestyle, and I'd be interested as to your perspective. My dad slept 3 nights a week for 30 years. So he'd work his day job as a consultant manager at Royal Infirmary, but he'd come home, he'd get ready, and then for 4 nights a week, Carl would pick him up and he'd be doing GP house calls all night. So he'd be out all night. He'd arrive again at 7:15 in the morning, get ready, and then drive through traffic into Manchester and work. So for 30 years, he only slept for 3 nights a week. So that is sleep deprivation, I would say, at a hyper extreme level. He was chronically stressed, of course. I hear what you say about empathy, and I think about mum and dad's rows.
Yeah.
And yes, you need a genetic susceptibility for autoimmune disease, but I believe my dad had that genetic susceptibility. I know he did because I've done my genetic, I've done some of my testing, and I know I have a predisposition as well to certain things if the environmental conditions are right. My dad had chronic sleep deprivation, chronic stress. Something maybe out with your expertise perhaps is I think my dad was very unhappy and had a lot of unexpressed emotions and anger about the state of his life. I've spoken to Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician, about the link between unexpressed emotion and autoimmune disease. So I'm not necessarily asking you to comment on that, but from what I've shared and from what you know about the immune system and sleep deprivation's impacts, do you have any comments at all?
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that for our biology to work, you need the right stuff, at the right concentration, delivered to the right tissues and organs at the right time of day. And of course, our circadian and sleep-wake systems do that. So if you disrupt them, you have a whole bunch of vulnerable points where things could fall apart.
Sorry to interrupt. If you are enjoying this content, there's loads more just like it on my channel. So please do take a moment to press subscribe, hit the notification bell, and now back to the conversation.
And so if you have a genetic susceptibility, then the disrupted biology will play to that problem. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was an element of sleep disruption. Did your father show any signs of dementia later in life?
It's really hard because his dad was on dialysis for 15 years and all kinds of medications. But yeah, I'd probably say so, little bits.
Yeah.
No formal diagnosis, but if I think back now, possibly, probably.
Yeah. Some very interesting data is showing that massive sleep-wake disruption in the middle years can increase your risk of dementia in later years.
What do middle years mean?
So in your sort of 40s, 50s,
right.
Your peak working period, where we think of our businessmen, having incredibly shortened sleep periods. And it's been well known, it's been documented, but a mechanism has not been clear until relatively recently, or a potential mechanism. And that's this newly discovered thing, which is the glymphatic system, this sort of clearance system within the brain. And whilst we're asleep, there's a whole bunch of toxic stuff that is wrapped out and disposed of, not least beta amyloid.
Yeah.
And just one night of no sleep has been shown to increase beta amyloid deposition within the brain and increase the concentration in the cerebral spinal fluid. So, there's a very tangible link between sleep disruption in the middle years and a mechanism that could predispose to dementia in later years. And I think we're going to find increasingly these sorts of connections.
Yeah.
I mean, what we know about the immune system is that it's turned up, or at least the adaptive immune system is turned up during the day when we're most likely to encounter people with bugs or bugs in the environment, and then turned down at night. And again, a really interesting question is, well, why? Why do you have the immune system on full kilter all the time? And that's, of course, because if you did, you increase the chances of an autoimmune response.
Yeah.
And so, disruption of these systems leads to lots of different ripple-through effects.
Yeah, there was something in the book where I found fascinating about our skin permeability changes throughout the day. Could you speak to that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, so at night, it's a bit more porous, and we're losing. As a result, we're losing water. And so also it becomes itchier. And so we're more likely to scratch our skin at night, and exacerbated by psoriasis and dermatitis and things. And so the skin is an incredibly effective barrier at keeping bugs out. And that's why the main route of infection is the lungs. But the skin is, again, trying to slough off these old cells and presumably the bacteria with them, and in a sense sort of cleanse itself, but it increases the vulnerability to infection. Does it at that time of day, of course, because we're far less likely to encounter bugs at that particular time.
Yeah, there was also this fascinating bit of research you shared where I think if we get cut or have a scar, or how well it will heal or how quickly it will heal depends on whether it was done in the morning or the evening.
Yeah,
I found that fascinating.
Yes, it is, and of course, more effective healing during the day than at night. Yeah.
Yeah. This relationship between midlife sleep deprivation, so in our 40s and 50s, and dementia later on, is really something just to pause on. Perhaps because I'm in my early 40s, perhaps because I know many listeners and viewers are. But there is this tendency, I think, across society to think we can keep pushing.
Yeah.
We can keep pushing. We'll get away with it. We'll be okay. Now, I've seen firsthand with my dad, yes, it was quite extreme, but nonetheless, I see that pattern. I've seen it in myself before. I've seen it in a lot of my patients and a lot of my friends. You can't keep pushing your biology and not expect a consequence at some point. So I just wanted to highlight that point. And then I want to, you mentioned sleep and dementia. I know you've done a lot of research on the relationship between sleep and mental health problems.
Yes.
And I'd love to just talk about this a little bit. Is it sleep deprivation that's causing mental health problems? Is it mental health problems that's causing sleep deprivation? Or like most things, is it a bit of both?
Well, I think this is really important. And I got into this because I was in an elevator with a psychiatrist. And he said to me, "Oh, yeah, you work on sleep and stuff." I said, "Yes, kind of." He said, "Well, of course, my patients with schizophrenia, they have terrible sleep patterns. That's because they don't have a job. So they get up late, miss my clinic, and are socially isolated, and so don't have friends." And I just thought at the time that doesn't make any sense at all to me. And so we started Katerina Wolf was one of my colleagues who was very much involved in this, to look at sleep-wake patterns in individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, same number of individuals age-matched who are unemployed, and working healthy controls. And the patterns you saw in schizophrenia were some of the most extraordinary observations I've ever made in my career. These weren't just sort of kindly, mildly disrupted. These rhythms were absolutely smashed in every one we have looked at. And so that stuck in my mind. And then with an increasing understanding of the mechanisms that generate sleep and circadian rhythms. So essentially, the consciousness sleep flip involves a realignment of every brain neurotransmitter system and an interaction between multiple brain structures. So with these two sort of observations, we thought, well, hang on, why do you always find sleep-wake disruption and mental health associated? And of course, you see it in bipolar, you see it in depression, you see it everywhere. And we came up with a model, which was perhaps at the core within the brain, there are overlapping neural circuits and neurotransmitter pathways between stable sleep and stable mental health. So if you're predisposed to mental health problems, let's say there's a change in a neurotransmitter, dopamine, serotonin, that nudges you towards a mental health crisis, but it's going to have a parallel impact upon the sleep-wake systems at some level because they also draw from those neurotransmitter systems. And so we then tested that hypothesis. And so genes which have been linked to human schizophrenia, when mutated in a mouse, not only showed weird behavioral patterns, but also smashed sleep-wake cycles. So now there's an incredible body of evidence for that mechanistic overlap between mental health circuits and sleep circuits. But it's, of course, much more complicated than that, because the disrupted sleep, via its impact upon psychosocial health, one's ability to process information, that negative salience, and of course the sort of physiological disruption could exacerbate the extent to which you're experiencing mental health problems. And of course, the mental health problems will feed back and make the sleep worse. And so you can very rapidly go from sort of this sort of overlap at the middle. We know there's a genetic predisposition to certain mental health conditions, but it can then amplify massively as a result of these positive feedback loops, the mental health making the sleep worse, the sleep making the mental health worse. So you can exaggerate it completely. So we then thought, well, hang on, if we try to stabilize sleep-wake in individuals exhibiting mental health problems, will we reduce the severity of those mental health problems? So working with Dan Freeman and Colin Espy, a big paper was published a few years ago in The Lancet, which showed that if you can even partially stabilize the sleep-wake in individuals, you can reduce levels of paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. So I think we can think of the sleep-wake systems as being a new therapeutic target for mental health. Now, what's fascinating for me is that we've known about the association between mental health problems and sleep disruption back at, Kraplin's time in the 1880s. He talked about it way before the introduction of antipsychotics and all of the other sort of issues. And so it has a long history. And of course, the life expectancy of individuals with severe mental health is hugely reduced. And they all report, what do they report? Sort of coronary heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, all of these major health issues dismissed as a byproduct of the antipsychotics. But actually, it's a major contributing factor to that will be the poor sleep. And it's never addressed. Yeah. And so this, I'm hoping that this will also provide a change in our mindset to these extraordinarily vulnerable individuals and to take their sleep-wake disruption seriously, because we have empirical evidence that even partial stabilization can reduce the severity of those symptoms.
You're effectively saying bipolar or depression or anxiety, right? Instead of just accepting it as, oh yes, people with these conditions don't sleep well, it's like, well, hold on a minute. What if we go straight in and give sleep education or sleep CBT or whatever therapy we might deem appropriate? And then if you think about research, I remember reading a paper, Russell, where it showed that maybe if you go from is it 8 hours a night, so 5 hours a night, your amygdala, the emotional part of your brain, may be up to 50% more reactive.
Yeah.
I think, well, that's kind of anxiety. You know, if
Yep.
your amygdala's on high alert, you're anxious.
Yes.
And sleep deprivation by itself will make you anxious.
Yeah.
So before we go to anti-anxiety medications or
Exactly.
it's like, why don't we tackle the sleep? Or why don't we at least
Exactly.
try to?
And it's because the failure to educate our general practitioners and indeed the entire doctor and nurse community. It's just not part of the curriculum. And in fairness, it's only fairly recently that this stuff has become really clear. And again, that was part of the reason for writing, Lifetime, because wanting to make it accessible to, not only medical practitioners, but everybody, so we can take some ownership of this field, this critically important field.
I mean, this is really quite profound because what we're talking about here is sleep as therapy.
Yes. I mean, this was really sort of shown to me when we were working on a project with Guy Goodwin, who's a psychiatrist at Oxford. And he was able to identify individuals as a result of family history and questionnaires, whether they were at high risk or low risk of developing bipolar. So these are young individuals in their teens usually. And what was absolutely fascinating is the sleep-wake patterns of those at low risk were perfectly normal. But all of those who were at high risk were already showing a disrupted sleep-wake pattern prior to any clinical diagnosis of bipolar. Now, if we can use this as an early marker, and then, of course, in therapy, the earlier we know something's going to go wrong, the earlier the chance of an intervention. So wouldn't it be amazing if we could identify those individuals at risk, we could institute sleep-wake stabilization protocols that may either delay the onset of these conditions or knock the brain into a different developmental trajectory whereby it won't necessarily go inevitably towards that condition. So again, I think there's we're just sort of unmasking all this incredibly important stuff that could have a major impact upon health and well-being in the coming decades.
Let's talk about sex and sleep.
Yeah.
You write a little bit about it, of course. It's a topic of huge interest to many people.
Yeah.
And I guess there's two facets to it, the way I see it. One is to do with fertility, right? There is an ideal time to have sex from a fertility standpoint. So I think it'd be great to talk about that.
Yeah.
But then I think also the relationship between sex and sleep, the onset of sleep, I think is also really interesting.
Yeah.
So in whatever way you want to, maybe start to unpack that for me.
Again, this was something that I wasn't particularly familiar with until I did the research for the book, because I'm often asked these questions in public lectures. What was absolutely striking is that every element in the regulation of the female menstrual cycle involves a circadian clock, whether it's the timed release of hormones, of the neurohormones in the hypothalamus, whether it's the pituitary gland, or whether it's the receptors in the ovary, for example, responding to those hormones. And so you've got, for example, very strong evidence that disruption of the menstrual cycle is much worse in night shift workers. The chances of miscarriage is higher in night shift workers. It's not hugely significant, but it is significant. And you find that in the airline industry, either pilots or flight attendants have fertility problems. So there's clearly a relationship between the circadian system and the menstrual cycle to produce this extraordinary, exquisitely timed ovulation and the release of the egg. And it's been shown that sperm needs to be in the reproductive tract, in the fallopian tube, around about 2 to 3 days prior to ovulation to have the greatest chances of success. So there's the circadian system interacting with the hormones that drive the menstrual cycle, which is and that precise window, and that was really fascinating. And then you got this study suggesting, well, it doesn't really matter. Humans don't have any real discrimination. They'll just do it whenever they want to do it. And then there's this whole literature on the fact that, in fact, our behavior is subtly altered. So that actually, during that sort of pre-ovulatory window, men are less discriminating of women and are much more likely to seek out copulatory experiences. And females are much more discriminatory. They're far more likely to have an affair during that window.
Wow.
And they look for they're more interested in male features. So, for example, a deeper voice, a stronger jawline, all that sort of thing. I mean, it's stuff that we never really think about, but there is that still biology, underpinning it.
Wow.
So yeah. But also, male fertility seems to peak in the morning. Testosterone rises and has a morning peak, and that's where sperm motility is at its peak. And anyway, I mentioned this, I think, on the Chris Evans breakfast show, and I got this email a month or so later from a couple of young medics who said, we've been trying for the last 2 years to conceive. And, as medics, we thought we'd tried everything, but we've forgotten circadian rhythms. So we started, and their words, not mine, started doing it in the morning. And the first time we did it, my partner got pregnant. Now, I mean, an N of 1 is an N of 1, so you can make of it what you will. But I was actually thrilled that bit of biology had been translated, at least in one case. Yes, I know.
Even that line, we forgot about circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. Like, we didn't learn anything about circadian rhythms at medical school. I don't think they still do.
No.
Right? This is a massive, massive issue.
Yeah.
So, regarding fertility, super, super interesting. I'm sure that's very relevant to many people listening, who are actively trying to conceive. It could be something that has practical value for them, or people can share it with people who they also know who are struggling. That might be helpful. In terms of, we mentioned the problems with sleep deprivation, and you've written a section in the book how the timing of sex could potentially help people with sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I think anecdotally, there were reports that, sex relaxes individuals and they're more likely to fall asleep. And there are now some studies suggesting that there are hormones that are released which actually promote sleepiness. And so, yes, consensual sex, of course, it has been shown to promote sleep. Yeah, and also masturbation as well.
You have once said that many people don't have a sleep problem. They've got a stress problem.
Yep.
And I guess sex, intimacy, switching off, it all kind of feeds into that a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And the bonding following sex, relaxes individuals and brings them closer together. I think that one thing that's very important to distinguish is fatigue from sleepiness. Sleepiness is cured by sleep. Fatigue is this overwhelming chronic tiredness that even given the ability to sleep longer, doesn't go away. And it's very important that people distinguish between the two, because fatigue, as you know, is indicative of some underlying health problem. And I spoke to somebody fairly recently, really fascinating, and this is a really high-powered individual, very, very active, but she has an immune issue and so is chronically fatigued. And so she can't get done what she wants to do during the day. So she'll fall asleep fine, and then she'll wake up in the middle of the night, and we should talk about that, because that's perfectly normal to wake up in the middle of the night. And most of us fall back to sleep again, or are awake for a short time and then fall back to sleep again. But because of her stress, because she couldn't do what she wanted to do, she couldn't fall back to sleep again. And so this was a really interesting, so the fatigue was not allowing her to do what she wanted to do, which meant that she was immensely stressed, which meant that it was screwing up her sleep problems. And so, I think that so many instances of, I think stress is one of the major issues in poor sleep. And as we've just said, it's not a sleep problem, it's a stress problem. And that's why sort of winding down towards the end of the day, leaving work at home, if you possibly can, and doing something different, whether it's going to the gym, whether it's doing whatever, is so important. And that's, of course, been the huge problem during the COVID epidemic, where people's workspace and home space were the same. And that's probably part of the reason why sleep has been reported to be worse in certain sectors.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke before about various scents and what people associate with sleep. And, we know the brain is an associative organ. And so if you are sitting with your laptop doing your work emails in bed, what does your brain associate with bed in the bedroom?
Precisely. And of course, so many bedrooms became studies.
Yeah, and I understand that it depends on your space, and it's not a criticism, it's just more an
explanation.
It's more an explanation that this can be problematic. I think, I mentioned the low lux amber bulbs that I have in my bedside lamps. And I think there's a biological explanation in terms of the lower lux, it's not pushing my circadian rhythm back, my clock's back, sure. But I actually think...
And critically reducing your alertness, which is probably the main factor.
Okay, so it's reducing my alertness because of the lower light.
Exactly. Higher the light, greater the alertness, and the more difficult it is to get off to sleep.
Okay, so that's fascinating, and I guess speaks to, so many bathroom mirrors are bathrooms are full of these bright LEDs, right? Yeah. So what do people do before bed?
Well, I know. I mean, I think it's absolutely spectacularly ironic that what's the last thing we do before we go to bed? We stand in the most brightly lit room of the house, which is the bathroom, and then we look into an illuminated mirror as we clean our teeth. And, we talked about an investment opportunity in developing night shift food. Another perfect investment opportunity is developing a bathroom mirror, which has bright, alerting light in the morning, and you switch it to the evening, which is dimmer, less alerting light in the evening.
Yeah, I mean, it's simple.
Yeah.
The technology's there to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's something else we can think about, what sort of light are we exposed to there. But speaking about these bedside lamps, I think also, as well as the biological explanation, I think there's also, I guess, something behavioral about them for me in terms of it signals to me, it's now evening time, it's rest time, it's not stimulation time. Do you know what I mean? So I think sometimes
winding down. We assume that we can go from a fully conscious state.
Yeah.
The gear analogy. Going from first gear to fifth gear. You can't do it. You have to do it through stages. And again, winding down from the wake state to the sleep state requires an adjustment. And whether that's, as you were saying, you enjoy reading some novel under relatively dim light before going to bed. Some people listen to music or something else that they find relaxing. And it's adopting those behaviors that make the transition easier. And again, it's as you were saying, it's the brain knows what's coming next, and what's coming next is sleep. And so it can prepare itself.
It's what we do with our kids, right? We give them a routine. We
read a story.
We read a story. We don't, as I often say in talks, we don't give them a ton of sugar, put the lights on bright, speak loudly. No, we do the opposite of all those things. But as adults, we kind of think we can somehow...
Until their favourite uncle visits.
Exactly. We think we can override them, but we can't. Oh, Russell, I could speak to you for hours. As we come towards the end of this conversation, a few things I wanted to briefly cover, if possible. Sleep trackers. Any view on sleep trackers?
Well, I think we should define where they could be useful. So most sleep trackers, if you use them to determine roughly when you went to sleep, how many times you woke up in the night, for example, and when you finally woke up. So your sleep timing, your sleep duration, and your sleep fragmentation. That's a tried and tested technology, and it's what we use in the lab. The problem is that most of the trackers that people wear these days try and do more than that. They say, you've had lots of good deep sleep, or you haven't had enough REM sleep. And for that, they're completely useless. And they can generate huge anxiety. So I spoke to an individual, again before lockdown, who said, I'm not getting enough slow wave sleep. I'm really anxious about it. In fact, what I do, I set my alarm clock for 4:00 in the morning, wake myself up to find out how much slow wave sleep I've had. I mean, that's the kind of level of anxiety that these things are developing. And in fact, so what does it really tell us if we've had lots of slow wave or lots of REM sleep? We don't really know. And the algorithms, first of all, are not very good at detecting that. And they've been largely worked out for a bunch of 20-year-olds in California. And of course, our sleep changes hugely as we age, and they're not going to work for somebody in their 70s or indeed, somebody younger. So until we got, really sophisticated artificial intelligence, plotting, extracting information to get sleep phase, they're not accurate.
Yeah.
And the other problem I have is, so what? Do we really know what slow wave sleep is all about? Well, sort of. I mean, we know that if people are selectively deprived of slow wave sleep, their memory isn't as good and their problem solving isn't as good. And if people are selectively deprived of REM sleep, then their emotional processing show a bit more anxiety during the day. But in a sense, we don't really know. Yeah. And so I do get very frustrated because we become, as a society, finally more sensitive to the importance of sleep. But what's happened is that a large sector have become very anxious about their sleep.
Yeah.
And, there's these sort of sergeant majors screaming, you've got to get 8 hours, you've got to do this, you can't do that. And we have to define what works for us.
Yeah.
And in fact, so many people think the sleep is what you get, but actually it's a highly dynamic bit of our biology, and we have the ability to work with it and optimize it. And I think that's something that and the sleep apps, drive us in the opposite direction. So I get a bit worried. I mean, in principle, good idea, because it's like losing weight. If you weigh yourself every morning and you see you've lost weight, that'll reinforce your changed eating behavior. And if you wanted to get longer sleep or different timing of sleep, as we've kind of touched on, it would be a useful metric to say, yes, well, that changed behavior has worked. So, getting that more morning light meant I did go to bed earlier and have got up earlier. So, in principle, they could be useful, but it's worth bearing in mind none of the sleep federations endorse any of the commercially available devices, and none of them are FDA approved.
Yeah.
So we're a long way for them being, I would say, useful.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very, very clear. I mean, that weight loss analogy, if we take it one step further, yes, if you see every day your weight is going down, let's say you are tracking that and you think that's a reasonable thing to track, sure, it can motivate behavior, but on that one day where it goes up, and I read a study once which said that actually our weights can vary, I think 3 to 10 pounds in any given day, I think it said, maybe 3 to 5 pounds, just from fluid and all kinds of other stuff. But I thought, well, actually it can have a really toxic effect when you're making all the right changes for your health and maybe for excess weight, but actually one day it happens to go the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a good point. What's the point? Yeah,
what's the point? Well, I think it could be problematic, and I have a real concern over trackers in general. I'm not at all saying they can't be useful for some people. I understand it probably depends on personality type a little bit in terms of what you do with that data. I do have a sleep tracker. I don't think I've used it for about 6 months. It was considered one of the good ones, and I have no problem with it. It was useful. There were certain things that I felt it helped me understand, which is if I eat late, it appears to really have an impact on various things. But I kind of learned what I needed to learn from it. And one day, Russell, I remember waking up feeling pretty good. And I looked at my sleep score and it was rubbish. And then my mind started to play tricks on me. I was like, oh, and then I thought, God, am I starting to feel tired? Like, because I'm tired or because of what I've just seen? I thought, you know what, screw this. I don't need to use this anymore. I need to tune into myself. And I personally, I've seen, even with blood pressure monitors, I've seen patients over the years tie themselves up in knots and have health anxiety. So I guess I would just urge a note of caution as well for people.
I think that's absolutely right. And we've talked about how do you know if you're getting enough sleep, what the factors are. That's the most important thing. And these are questions we can answer for ourselves without the need of a health tracker. Good friend of mine, Ken Wright, who's University of Colorado. He starts his class, and it's a large number of students, with who here has ever used a sleep tracker. And, essentially the whole class sort of put their hand up. And they said, who now is using one routinely? And about 3 hands go up. And, these are smart people. They learn pretty quickly that these devices just don't work. And as you've discovered, you embrace the knowledge from your own personal experiences.
To be a human. and to really experience what that means. Just very quickly, a lot of people will often say about light exposure, well, what about, let's say Scandinavia, for example? I guess that's top of mind because I've been recently. The hotel in which I stayed had pretty poor blackout blinds. And so I woke up in the night and then I thought it was morning and I looked at my watch. It's 3 a.m. It was bright at 3 a.m. How have people in Northern Hemisphere countries or other countries where there are these wildly different day and night cycles, have they evolved to that? Have they adapted to that? Do we know?
Well, the short answer is no, but let me tell you about a group of animals that have. And from the University of Tromsø, they've looked at Arctic reindeer. And during the 2 months of constant light, they turn their biological clocks off. And during the 2 months of constant dark, they turn their clocks off. They have no adaptive value. There is no day-night cycle. And in fact, during the winter months, these reindeer feed whenever the weather conditions permit. And during the summer, of course, they have to feed constantly to put on enough fat to survive the winter. So there are instances where clocks have been turned off because they have no adaptive value. What about humans? Well, we've, of course, been there for the Europeans who've moved into those places have shown no signs of adaptation. In fact, in Tromsø, a family will get up and then they'll go in winter, for example, into a room where there's artificial light. So they'll get that morning photon shower. And so they can try and stabilize. And they use very effective blackout curtains. Wow. Now, what's going on with those peoples, the native peoples who've been there for 30, 40,000 years, isn't clear.
Yeah.
And it may well be that there has been some adaptation, but we don't know.
Russell, my brain is going so fast in so many different directions. Out of respect to your time, I'm going to stop firing questions at you, and I hope I can persuade you at some point in the future for a part 2. To finish off this conversation on an upbeat note, for people who feel inspired to prioritize their sleep, to get on top of their sleep, to basically go, you know what? Maybe it was the bit about being in your 40s to 50s and not pushing it. Whatever it might have been that connected with them. This podcast is called Feel Better, Live More. When we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of our lives. Of course, when we're going to sleep better, we're going to get more out of every aspect of our lives. So do you have any final words of wisdom, advice, practical, whatever it might be to leave my listeners with?
I mean, I think the key thing for me is that, sleep is like shoe size. One size does not fit all. And we as individuals need to work out what's best for us because there's huge individual variation and our sleep will change. So a good example would be waking up in the middle of the night. So what's happened is that our sleep episode has been compressed. And so we tend to not wake up in the middle of the night. But in societies where there's no electric light, and indeed from the literature, we know our sleep patterns in the recent past were very different. Mm-hmm. So the literature from the pre-industrial age talks about, I had a wonderful first sleep, and sleep was biphasic, going to sleep, waking up, then going back to sleep again, or indeed polyphasic, which is several periods of waking up. And because we don't know that, when people wake up in the middle of the night, they think, oh my goodness, that's it. I'm never going to get back to sleep again. I might as well start doing my emails now and start drinking coffee. And the key thing is that waking up in the middle of the night need not mean the end of sleep. In fact, that polyphasic or biphasic sleep pattern is what all mammals experience. Wow. And so this, again, single block of consolidated one block of sleep is not the natural state.
That is such an important message, isn't it? The amount of people who feel bad that they wake up. I know the amount of questions that get fired at me about this. Is it okay? And you're clearly saying, no, this is not only okay, it's very, very normal. Yeah. I guess this speaks to the problems with having our smartphones in our room. Just looping back, I don't know, you mentioned, and not in this conversation, I've heard you say, about your relationship with your BlackBerry when you were in Australia and actually had to ultimately leave it in your lab.
Yes, I'm just sort of, I think they used to be called crackberries. And yeah, I was in Australia. And so I would do my Australian emails on the BlackBerry. Then, of course, the European ones would come in. And then the North American. So if you're jet lagged, and I remember, this red blinking light, those who had a BlackBerry. And I was so weak, I could not, first of all, it was by the bed. And of course, I then moved it very quickly to the room next door. And that was hopeless because I'd wake up and then I'd go next door. And so I left it in the lab. And of course, as a result, I got much better sleep.
Yeah, because when you wake up, if you're not getting your mind actively engaged back into work, a lot of us probably don't realize that we may well have fallen asleep again had we not done that.
And that's what most of us do. In fact, we go through cycles of REM and non-REM, and we naturally wake from REM sleep, and then we fall back to sleep again without even noticing it. Yeah. Now, that wake-up period can be, a few seconds, so you don't notice it, or it may be 30 minutes. But the chances are you will go back to sleep as long as you stay relaxed, you keep the lights low, and you do something that is not alerting the brain. And as I say, because we haven't ever passed this information on, people don't know when they think, oh my goodness, that's the end of sleep, I'm sleeping terribly. And in fact, if you stay calm, it's fine. The other thing, another tip, I guess, would be illuminated alarm clocks. Because many people clock watch. They'll wake up and then they think, oh my God, I've only got 2 hours before the alarm goes off. It doesn't matter. If you go back to sleep, and you have that additional 2 hours or half an hour, again, it doesn't matter. So if you have an illuminated clock, put some tape over the front of it. The only thing that matters, I guess, is the alarm, not how long you've got before the alarm goes off.
Which brings us back to the start of the conversation, which is alarm clocks stop the single most important behavioral experience we have.
If that conversation resonated with you, here is another incredibly powerful one.
Digestive issues, mental focus issues, exacerbation of every major psychiatric disorder from OCD to ADHD is closely associated with disruptions in circadian clock function. The foundational practice that I truly believe every person should do every day is